For today's video, I decided to record the process of what it was like getting into 3D printing, as well as speed paint the models under 20 minutes to see is the quality actually good enough to be speed painted. Full disclosure, I got the Elegoo Mars for Ultra as well as the Wash and Cure Station as review products. I start off by shaking the devil out of this bottle as that helps the resin consistency. From there, the process was simple enough as to pour it into the vat and make sure that I don't go over the max line. When I selected the files I wanted, all I had to do was just send them via the Wi-Fi and it was ready. It was time to watch the magic happen as the build plate descended into the vat of resin. For the next 2 hours, the build plate went up and down, creating the models themselves in very thin layers. 2 hours later, it was done. And with the easy stuff out of the way, it was time to get to the cleaning process. Now, interestingly enough, I sort of expected all resin to be gone from the build plate, but it was actually dripping with the stuff. Afterwards, using one of these scrapers to essentially remove the models from the build plate. It didn't require that much force, however, it did require quite a bit to find the perfect crevasse where you can put the little spatula into. And for the last step of the process, using the Elegoo Wash and Cure stations. However, before that, I decided to use this little vat of alcohol just to remove the excess resin from the miniatures, as I had almost 2.5 liters of isopropyl alcohol in that vat. My intention in this is to keep the large amount of alcohol much cleaner and then recycle the smaller amounts much more often. Then I removed the models from the supports that were attached to them. Out of interest, I also grabbed my UV flashlight to see just how much spillage there was around the desk, even though it looked relatively clean to me. In theory, this should also be curing the resin, preventing it from spreading further around the room. I don't know if that actually helps, so I still treat it as if it's spreading around. Then it was time to turn on the Elegoo washing station and give these models their final clean. And as the water started spinning, I realized that I entirely forgot to put in the miniatures as I was relocating the camera to showcase the process, then transferring them to their sunbed known as the Elegoo curing station. From what I read, this is the most important part of the process as it's what's finally gonna make the models safer to touch. So I made sure to leave them for about 10 minutes. And with that, the miniatures were finally done. As unfortunately didn't get to record the bare, essentially resin look of those previous miniatures, I did find this extra part that I wanted to show exactly what it looks like before it was primed. And it has a similar thing where the entire surface is perfectly smooth with the exception of a few of those layer lines at the top, which I actually found out later that you can reduce even further by increasing the print time. For this, I'll be giving myself a challenge where I want to paint every single model under 20 minutes and guarantee the fact that I'll be using a wash on every single one of them, just to make sure that if there's any flaws in the models, they'll be revealed much more easily. For the miniatures, I decided to go for this brain bug from Puppets War Miniatures, this really cool Heretical Commissar from Red Makers, and an awesome looking zombie from Station Forge. Unfortunately, I ended up disqualifying this Commissar mainly because he has far too many details for me to paint, and I can't really see a reasonable way to speed paint him in under 20 minutes. When I started painting the Krieg zombie, the number one thing I noticed right away was the fact that the surface was essentially exactly the same as plastic miniatures. It was entirely smooth, and the only place I could really notice one layer line was essentially the top of the helmet. In the past, when I dealt with 3D printed models, they tend to have these very rigid surfaces that aren't really terrible, however, you can notice them, and when you're painting them, your brush is essentially hitting all these tiny little ridges. I'd say that was the most prominent thing, and the number one thing I noticed right away when I started painting these models. It's part of the reason why I wanted to speed paint this model and to use an excessive amount of washes. As personally, I think you could polish a turd into looking like a precious gem, however, it's a lot more difficult to use very rough and fast techniques and have good results if there's inherent issues with the model. Interestingly enough, because I knew I could essentially print as many of these models as I wanted, I was quite indecisive in my paint job as I kept trying new things and just doing different ideas as to where I want this Krieg zombie to be. At this point, I also decided to try applying a metallic paint and see if it would have a very perfect shiny surface, or if there were flaws in the details, you would notice them right away. For example, the top of the helmet, the layer lines I mentioned earlier, are very prominent and easily to notice, even though they are very faint and much smaller than in the previous models I've worked with. And the design of the model itself was actually very fantastic, and it was really easy to paint, especially with the open arms. I didn't have to reach any underside of the model, so it was quite fun and I really enjoyed it. For the theme of the miniature, I essentially went with the idea that this is actually a Nurgle plague, which is why he's very green. And then the one detail I decided to pick after the model was done was to add some of these leather colors to the straps. Moving on to the brain bug, I decided to try something else entirely, and I started off by essentially airbrushing the model with a very speed painting technique similar to my 10-minute Tyranid. I wanted to test out the dry brushing on this model to see if it would reveal any of the layer lines or any of the flaws in the details that I might have left in the model during the process. As similar to a wash, usually in 3D printed models, you start to reveal a lot of these details and issues when you start dry brushing. And the only noticeable things I found were the essentially support areas where those very large pillars were connected to the model that helps it essentially print stably. But I couldn't actually spot any visible layer lines even after applying a wash. And afterwards, as the whole process was very quick, I actually ended up having quite a lot of extra time left, so I ended up focusing a lot on the brain and giving it some extra details that I thought just made the model really cool and just gave it that extra pop. I also added a slight amount of black to this turquoise colors just to essentially desaturate it a little bit and give it a slightly more of an organic look rather than just a pure saturated color. And at this model, you could actually see those tiny little dots on the back of the carapace. That's where the support lines were connected. Now, if I wasn't lazy, I probably could have cleaned it, so that's something that's entirely on me rather than, for example, the printing process itself. And now the two miniatures are done, I just realized one of them is a massive brain, the other one doesn't have a brain. And then for the final detail for the brain bug, I ended up giving him this slightly red horn and then just applying a wash over it just to smooth out the details. And at the end, I think the actual process is actually quite interesting and I enjoyed it quite a bit. However, it's definitely something that requires quite a bit of time, effort, and proper safety precautions.